Hello and welcome to Lesson 3, continuing on with our pursuit of the big questions and an exploration of how literature, particularly the narratives and great works of literature, can help us better understand, better grapple with some of the biggest questions that human beings ask. For this lesson, we're looking at two short stories, The Signal Man by Charles Dickens and The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. So both really giants in the history of literary studies, both very influential authors writing around the same time, one in England, the other in the US. So we're jumping a bit farther ahead chronologically because we last looked at the ancient Greeks. And as I mentioned, we will jump around chronologically because our focus isn't studying one specific place or time or culture. Our focus is studying literature in general, introducing you to literature, and showing you how literature can help you better grapple with these big questions. And so with that in mind, I'd like to give you a variety of text to read. And you'll see that today in this lesson with the very obvious differences in the style of writing here from what we just studied, because what we just studied in lesson 2 was epic poetry. So there was a narrative structure, but the style of writing was poetic. Here we have fiction, short fiction, something probably you're much more familiar with, closer to the types of things you might like to read today, as novels are the most popular literary form today, and those are fiction. And Charles Dickens, our first author, is one of the most famous novelists of all time, and he was writing at a time when the novel first became popular. So you're getting some exposure to fiction here. And as to our topic of the lesson, the big question for this lesson, why should we relate to other people? This builds on the big question from lesson 2, which was how should we relate to other people? So we talked about, with the example of the Iliad and Achilles' character growth, how we can best interact with other people, how we can set aside our own desires once we truly see our connection to someone who may seem very different from us. So that was a great example of how to relate to other people. But now we're going to get at the why, which I think is important when pursuing any kind of topic. If we can see how to relate to other people, we should also ask why even bother in the first place. And I think this is a really important question in the wake of COVID-19, which isn't really over yet, even though we've been able to perhaps interact with people a bit more in the last few months than we had for most of 2020. And so I say this is a burning question, because when the pandemic started and the government in most states required people to quarantine in pretty significant ways, lots of different views came up. I even saw studies where people talked about how isolation is a good thing or could be a good thing in certain contexts. I personally tend to disagree with those studies, but what they show is in open debate. COVID-19 asks us to reevaluate the importance of interacting with other people, because that option was pulled off the table for really the first time in probably most of our lives. And so this is a very important question. In both of these stories, as you'll see, they're very similar. They show us the effects, the negative effects of alienation and, moreover, isolation. And so you could say I'm making an argument here that isolation is a bad thing, and that we should very much so relate to other people, that it's incredibly important. While I do take that stance, these are complex stories, and I want the topic to be open to debate, and I want to hear your opinion on it. One other thing I'd like to address before we jump into the lesson is the tone and style of the pieces we're reading, because these are both very bleak pieces, and so was Oedipus. And if you have the Iliad as being the most optimistic thing you're reading some pretty bleak literature. So I want to do two things. One is to reassure you that there will be more optimistic, hopeful pieces coming. And two, reassure you there's an intentionality to the class. Clearly, this question builds on the one from last week. So while the literary pieces may feel random, the questions are in a very intentional order that will continue to make sense as we go. And finally, the third thing I want to say, and this comes back to the idea of catharsis, is that when reading bleaker literature, and again, I reassure you, it's not going to be all this bleak, there can still be great hope and wondrous things that come from that. I want to real quickly use an example I read about recently, which was in Yellowstone Park. A number of years ago, there was an issue with the deer population. And the deer population in Yellowstone Park was eating so much grass, so much of the vegetation, that certain species didn't have enough for themselves and died out or left. The water and the rivers dried up, and so they actually introduced some wolves to Yellowstone Park. And these wolves regulated the deer population in a way that caused the grass to grow back, the rivers to fill up, some of the other species to return. And so the introduction of this dangerous, violent element, wolves, actually helped the park get better, helped the ecosystem get better. And so it sucks to be the deer in that situation, and the wolves are real. So I'm not trying to say that we need to ignore pain and suffering. On the other hand, what I'm really saying is that pain and suffering can lead to something greater and more wondrous. Getting there can be very difficult. And so I ask you to bear with me as we read some of these darker pieces, and I think you'll like where the class is going. But that's enough preamble. Let's get to Charles Dickens and the Signal Man. We're going to talk a little bit about the time in which Charles Dickens was writing, because it varies to which degree historical context is important with what we're reading. It's always important to some degree, but this particular time in which Charles Dickens was writing, in the middle of the 1800s, most of the texts and works produced then were really influenced by the culture, his even more so than others. So I'm going to give you some background on Charles Dickens. He was Victorian England's most beloved and distinctive novelist. So Victorian England is the time in England when Victoria was queen, from 1837 to 1901. And so we usually refer to that time period as the Victorian period because she was such a significant and influential ruler. And the people from that time period is the Victorians, the Victorian people. And so you'll hear some mention of Victorian England in this lesson. A little bit on Dickens, because his biography is very helpful to understanding this story. 2 days before his 12th birthday, Dickens began work labeling bottles of shoe polish. So his family was very poor, and at 12 years old, he had to go to work in this, shoe polish factory, which is just, pretty brutal work for a 12-year-old kid. 2 weeks later, his father went to debtor's prison, which was a thing. If you were in too much debt in England at this time, you actually had to go to prison. Different than the regular prison system, not as harsh, and actually the family would go with them. So Dickens' siblings had to go with his father to debtor's prison while he continued to work in this shoe polish factory. And so these traumatic childhood experiences with labor and debt, etc., growing up poor, really influenced the emotional concerns of his fiction, as I'm sure you can already see if you've read The Signal Man before watching this. As he became an adult, he eventually began working as a journalist and initially published what he called sketches, which were basically really short pieces of fiction, even shorter than a story like The Signal Man, and it was just a description of a character. So he became known for these really interesting, entertaining characters, and that propelled him into his career as a novelist, where he was very, very successful. Some of the things that were pretty common in his writing, other writers of the time, were illustrated serial publications. So his texts had illustrations, and you do get to see one example of that in the Signal Man, which I always find interesting when I read novels from this time, because most novels we read today don't have illustrations, and I love how visuals enhance something. The other is serial publications. So you'd have pretty long novels during this time, and readers would only get a chunk at a time, probably about the length of The Single Man, which would be about 2 or 3, maybe 4 chapters in a longer novel, and they would get those in monthly or weekly installments, and so they'd have to read it over time, which really influenced the reading experience and the structure of the text. So just a few unique things about the time he was writing that can kind of help hopefully flesh out the picture of who Dickens was and help you understand the story better and why it's so important. He was known for being an author who depicted great family values in his stories. For instance, one of his most well-known works is A Christmas Carol, but his unstable home life actually contradicted that. Early on, he was like this man who was like a pillar of family values because he had 10 children with his wife. But then he left his wife for a much younger actress named Ellen Turner in the last decade of his life. So this is a really poor look at his character, but I think it helps us understand a few things. One is the complexity of his writing, but moreover that we shouldn't hold up novelists or artists or really any human beings as saints. They're people too, people who struggle and make mistakes like us. And so do we stop reading Dickens' books or even disregard the moral lessons in them because of his own immorality? No, but we can see the flaws of humanity and perhaps understand humanity better by taking the historical context into consideration when we read these texts. He also embarked on a series of lucrative but exhausting professional readings. So he would go around to different cities and actually in different countries. He visited the U.S. several times and read aloud from his novels. And he was an actor too. He was in plays, so he'd really perform the things he was reading from his novels. And these became incredibly popular, led to him being the most popular novelist in the entire world in the middle of the 1800s when he was writing. And so he was the way he had this reading public and engaged with this reading public, and his relationship with Ellen Turner actually negatively impacted his relationship with his reading public. So you can make the argument he was the first real celebrity in the way we understand celebrities today, because you didn't have people who interacted with their reading public, prior to the mid 1800s. Finally, his writings have a broad and continuous cultural afterlife. In other words, you see things like The Muppets' Christmas Carol. His texts, probably second only to Shakespeare, have become so famous that you see all different kinds of versions of them in popular culture. So here's a portrait, if you will, of one of the most famous writers of all time. Let's take a look now at one of, I think, his best pieces of short fiction, because I'm not making you read one of his lengthy novels, and see how that piece of short fiction can teach us some things about how we should relate we should relate to other people. And here's, like I said, the illustration from the story. I like to use visuals as much as I can when I teach, which is hard to do in an English class, but I try to work them in when I can. And so, again, our big question is, why should we relate to other people? So let's dive into this story and see what it has to tell us about this question. Here's about 5 threads or themes we're going to pursue. The first is this story presents 2 themes simultaneously that are intertwined, one of reality and another of unreality. So on the reality side, this story is a social commentary on the working conditions for the single man. On the other side, unreality is the supernatural appearance of ghosts. So you've got 2 things going on. Dickens, having worked in that shoe polish factory when he was younger, often depicted the difficult working conditions for various jobs. The 1800s in Victorian England was time of emerging industry as the country became urban and there were many more jobs. So there were all kinds of odd jobs, like being a signalman. And Dickens really liked to write about those and show his readers what the working conditions were like for people who did those jobs. And so that's the realistic part of this story. But then you also have ghosts. Ghosts were a popular theme entity Dickens liked to include in his stories, a popular image, common image for him, like in A Christmas Carol. And so you've got reality and unreality intertwined meeting here. That's a very important part of how this story works. This bullet point should be set off on its own, and it should say number 2. So I apologize for that confusion there, but this is progress. So trains are very important in this story, as we'll see in a minute, but the trains represent the sweeping changes of the time period. So, as I said a minute ago, this was a time of great urbanization and industrialization, and you had people who, lived, say, on farms out in the countryside who, had to travel by stagecoach for several hours to get to London, to do business in London. All of a sudden, in the middle of the century, you get trains are invented and built. And so all of a sudden you can get to London in an hour or two instead of, half a day. And that really shakes things up. And that's one of many similar types of changes. And so what you have is incredible progress at an exponential rate. I mean, imagine if you've never seen a train before in your life, and then you're 20 years old or 30 years old, and trains just start appearing all around the countryside where you live. That would be a pretty jarring thing. And the speed at which they travel, compared to, say, riding in a coach pulled by horses, really is this great symbol for how fast things were industrializing and urbanizing and changing at this time. So progress is something we usually think of as a good thing, but there's always a cost whenever there's progress. And I think this story shows the cost of progress really well. And it gives us something to think about because we've seen a lot of changes in our own life. I think particularly of technology like smartphones, the accessibility of the internet, those kinds of things I think are parallel here. And so this story can give us a good, useful, helpful reflection on progress. Another thing is microcosm and macrocosm. So this story is, on the one hand, very specific. The signalman thing is an odd job, and it's very focused on trains. So it's very specific. But like I just pointed out with the last bullet point, the train represents so much more than just a train. It represents the sweeping, rapid nature and consequences of progress. And so the signalman and his little specific job are very unique, but they stand in for, figuratively here, the bigger things going on at the time. So something little and specific represents something big. And along these lines, I want to give you some cultural context about trains. There was a huge train crash at the Clayton Tunnel in 1861, which is what this story is a little bit based on. There was also a Staplehurst rail crash in 1865. Dickens was on that train, and he survived. So he was in an actual train crash, and he experienced that. And he wrote this story in 1866, so just 1 year later. And he'd already depicted a major railway crash in his novel Dombey and Son from about 20 years earlier, because trains started to first appear in England in the 1840s. So trains, something that's probably an afterthought to you nowadays, because unless you live right by trains, you probably don't hear them or see them that much, were just this huge deal back then, and they represent so much here, having to do with progress, the terror and the consequences of progress. Finally, a couple of other things we'll look at is the idea of doubling. You've got really only 2 characters in a relatively long, short story with the signalman and the narrator. And in a way, they're kind of like, you could almost argue, doubles of each other. You've also got all of these instances of pairings, the reality and the unreality I mentioned earlier, the narrator walking above the ground and the signal man living below the ground. So all these doublings or pairings are very symbolic, and we'll see what Dickens does with those. Finally, the theme of isolation and alienation, which are not exactly the same thing, but almost always paired together. Alienation is being cut off from society, and isolation is living by oneself, which is clearly what the signal man's unique career entails. It leads to isolation and alienation. And like I said, COVID-19 has led to significant isolation and alienation for many people, kind of like the signal man, not by choice. And so this is, in a way, the most important theme we'll pursue, because it gets at that our main question, right, of why should we relate to other people? Here's a picture. Like I said, I really like to use visuals. So this is the Clayton Tunnel entrance. And you can see just from this image how it's terrifying, because if a train goes into that tunnel, it can't see what's on the other side. And so, like I said, in 1861, a train went into the tunnel, didn't know there was one on the other side, couldn't see it, right? Boom, collision. And so that's why the signalman's job was so important. So here's a visual illustration of the importance of his job and the terror of the consequences of it. An illustration, ideally, hopefully, of what trains represented to the Victorian people at this time. Something that might be hard for us in the 21st century to wrap our minds around, so hopefully the picture helps. Okay, let's take some look at some quotes from the story and see how they help us answer some questions that can in turn help us get at these themes or threads, which we talked about, which will ideally help us answer the big question of why should we relate to other people. So close reading here. If we were meeting in the classroom, the first question I would ask you, and then I would jot some things on the board because I really like getting your reactions, is how would you describe the working conditions for the signal man? What effect do reading these passages have on you as a reader? As I mentioned, the story is very bleak, and I think that's important to the message it's trying to convey. And so just reading, the description of where the signal man works, how did that make you feel as a reader? And I think those feelings you can tap into when you read the description of his working conditions can be very important to understanding the story. So let's take a look at a passage I think describes those working conditions really well from early on in the story when the narrator first meets the signal man. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as ever I saw. On either side, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective one way only, a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon. The shorter perspective in the other direction terminating in a gloomy red light, and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to the spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. So much happens in this passage. I love the final line, as if I had left the natural world, because you have the narrator in the opening scene walking down from the ground up above into what we call a cutting, which is like an opening in the ground, which is where the signal man lives. He lives in a hole in the ground, a cutting. And so, on one hand, this is a realistic thing. This is where signalmen actually lived, in these types of places in England in the 1860s. But it seems so unnatural to live in such a dark, gloomy place that the narrator says it feels as if he left the natural world when he walks down there. This is that collision of reality and unreality. It's a real thing, but it's so bleak that it's hard to believe it's a real thing. And then you've also got it called a dungeon. The sun barely ever shines there. So Dickens is really trying to draw attention to how deplorable these working conditions are for the signal man. I would sum up by saying the signal man works in incredibly dismal conditions where even the sun does not shine. The depth of the cutting where he works physically isolates him and psychologically alienates him from the rest of society. So he's literally put in a hole in the ground away from the rest of the world. I don't know about you, but I've talked to people who that was how they felt during COVID-19 because they just couldn't go out and see other people. Moving along, I want to pursue this question of the microcosm and macrocosm, that theme, because the signal man's job is really unique. Excuse me, you may never have heard of a signal man before reading this story, but he represents, in a macro way, something much larger than himself. So let's look at a quote that shows that. His pain of mind was most pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. So you have, in the passage we looked at on the last slide, the gloomy, isolated working conditions. Combine that with the responsibility of the job, right? He has to give these signals to trains. And if he doesn't do it correctly, there could be a collision, a death, multiple deaths. And so he's not only living in this dark and gloomy place, he's bearing a huge responsibility on his shoulders, the consequences of which are the loss of human life. In some ways, you could argue there's no bigger responsibility. And Dickens makes the point here through the narrator that he's a conscientious man. He has his conscience at work. He's a good man who wants to do his job right. So that makes the responsibility even heavier. So this is a really sympathetic character then who can relate to on many levels. What does he represent from the time period in a more macro way? The signal man's concern that another accident will occur, as well as his efforts to try to stop it, embody Victorian fears over the dangers of railway travel. So something so new, people were really worried about railroad accidents, even though they rode on trains all the time because they were so convenient. And so the responsibility that weighs on the signal man's shoulders then figuratively represents the fears many people have about traveling on trains. This leads me to an important question that I'm not going to answer now. I just wanted to marinate in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of this lecture, and it will be one that appears on the discussion board. What fears and concerns do many people have today? So we see how railway travel was a fear for the Victorians. Railway travel is not really a fear for us in 2021, but this story represents more than just what it's about. It's about much more than railway travel. So if the Victorians were scared of railway travel, what are the things you and many others are scared of today? And what are maybe some of the similarities, right? If we extrapolate out from railway travel, what are the things they're afraid of there? Death by a new, powerful, helpful, but perhaps not completely stable technology? Anything come to mind today that reminds you of? Okay. For some reason, the bullet points aren't flying in on this next slide, and I apologize. But this will be the last passage we look at, and this relates to the idea of isolation, alienation, and our big theme of why should we relate to other people. And I ask, why are the conversations between the signal man and the narrator important? Here's a passage. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. So here the narrator weaves together the two strands of the story that we've talked about already, reality and unreality, as he both displays skepticism regarding the supernatural apparitions and tries to help the signal man maintain his sanity. I think ultimately this story is about a guy slowly losing his mind as he does this job in deplorable conditions that contains a huge burden of responsibility. And we see multiple interactions between the narrator and the signal man, and this is still just the first one. I forgot to update the page number there, and I apologize. I've taught this story in other classes using a different textbook, and so the page number's wrong there. Be reassured, this is early in the story. So my point is, this is their first conversation, so he's still skeptical that the signal man has actually seen ghosts. And as the story progresses, he starts to believe the signal man more and more. So what's important is, even though he's skeptical of this man here, he doesn't dismiss the man. He doesn't say, you're just kind of crazy, you think you're seeing ghosts. He really tries to help him. He says, yes, you've got a big responsibility, but you understand the importance of it and you do your job well. The story says several times that the signal man was like the best at his job in all of England. So he's trying to reassure him, like the implication here is you probably think you're seeing ghosts because this job is really starting to weigh on you, but have confidence in that you've done your job well so far and you understand the importance of it. So what he's really doing here is counseling. He's counseling the signal man, which means he cares about this person and he's trying to help him, and he's setting aside his own desire to perhaps dismiss the idea of a ghost to just help this guy. And so we see the importance of talking to other people. Unfortunately, the narrator's not able to save the signal man, but I think in their few conversations they have, we see how important it is to talk to other people, to interact with other people, how the narrator can almost, kind of try to help the signal man here just through conversation. This is such a complex story that I want to just kind of recap some of the most important things from it to kind of help, orient you, tie everything together before we look at the discussion board questions. So it has narrative complexity. That's why we're doing this. And these are key features of Dickens's works. So if you want to read more Dickens, and he's actually, to be honest, just cards on the table, my favorite author. So if you want to read longer works of his, I really recommend Oliver Twist, Great Expectations. My personal favorite is Our Mutual Friend, followed by my second personal favorite, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Bleak House and Little Dorrit are also very good. If you want to read more of his work, these are things you'll see in all of his works. There's always narrative complexity, multiple intertwined narratives, so he often has different stories that seem unrelated that are eventually connected, and you have the intertwining of the signal man story with the narrator's story here. Significant use of physical space. Where the signal man lives is crucial to understanding the story. World building, it's almost, as the narrator says, as if we enter another world when we enter the signal man's world. And so Dickens builds just these fascinating worlds in his story that are both, we usually think of world building with fantasy, but here we have a world that's very real but still has these fantastical elements. And Dickens is able to teach us a lot about reality through that technique. Memorable characters. It's hard to forget either of the two characters here. And as I said, Dickens, made his claim to fame through his memorable characters. Doubling many of his stories. And another great one is A Tale of Two Cities, where obviously the two cities are doubles, but then the narrative hinges on the two main characters are two men who look almost identical. The story doesn't work without that doubling. Here you have the doubling of the signal man and the narrator. Social commentary. This is what Dickens was probably most famous for. We really see that here with his depiction of the working conditions for the signal man. Finally, from social commentary, what I would call a conscience activating call to action. One textbook describes Dickens as the novelist's campaign to bring about the transformation of the individual human heart. So it wasn't just social commentary, it was social commentary coupled with a call to action. You know, the job the signalman works probably shouldn't exist. There should be a better way to do this. It's a necessary evil with the advent of railway travel. So we see the cost of progress. Railway travel is great because you can get to London much faster, so that revolutionizes the economy and all kinds of other good things. But the cost is people living and working like the signalman does in his job. He's the best at his job, but it still leads to his demise. And so Dickens wanted the human heart to be transformed while people read texts like the signalman so that they could go out and perhaps try to create change. Before we get to the questions, I want to just give you a few statements which are conclusions, because that was kind of just a list of themes. Here's like conclusions I have come to as a reader, having read and worked through the story multiple times. Repetition reflects alienation. For example, the narrator repeats a complex process to travel down to meet the signalman 3 times. I used the wrong word there. So you have repetition. You know, the signalman sees 3 ghosts. The narrator travels down to talk to him 3 times. There's a process here. Like I said, each time the narrator starts to believe him more. Each time the accidents get worse. Eventually, with the eventual result being the signalman himself dies. And so this is showing the alienation. Because he has to do the same job over and over again, that's part of what causes him to be alienated, causes him to lose his mind, and eventually leads to his life, the end of the story. Because you could ask the question, why isn't he able to stop the last accident? If he's the best at his job in all of England, like the text says, why does he himself die? Because he's lost his mind. He's lost his grip on reality from doing not only a dismal job with a huge moral weight, but doing that job over and over again. So the narrative structure of the story reflects that. The physical space of the story also displays alienation. The narrator must travel down into a hole in the ground to enter the world of the signalman, and that acts as a conduit between his world and ours. So I talked about world building, reality, unreality. The signalman's world is both real, unreal at the same time. That's what the ghosts, you can debate whether the ghosts are real or not. It doesn't really matter if the ghosts are real or not. What matters is what they represent. And so what they represent is a world that's very bleak, so bleak it's almost unreal, but in reality it was indeed real. Thankfully, we're spared from doing jobs like the signalman did. And so the narrator, you could say, crosses a threshold when he travels into the signalman's world. And that, again, represents this idea of alienation, isolation. Riding on trains in the 19th century was also an alienating experience. So the danger of train riding represents the relinquishing of control of one's actions to another, with a resulting loss of or alienation from power. So the fears people had about train travel that were embodied by the signalman's character are essentially turning over control. You put yourself in this vehicle and you may not make it out the other side, but once you're on there, there's nothing you can do. I flew on a plane last week, and I had that feeling as I was getting on the plane. Airline crashes are very rare, and there hasn't been one in a long time, but there's nothing I can do to stop one once it starts. If I'm on the plane with my wife and my kids, that's a scary thought. And I think that's how many people felt when COVID-19 started, right? Because you couldn't control this. You couldn't control whether you'd get sick or not. You couldn't control where you could go or not because the government was telling you. And so there was a sense of a loss of control, a loss of power. And that's incredibly alienating, on top of the isolation. And more generally, the story provides a lament over the changes wrought by Victorian progress. So a lament over the cost of progress. And I think if we look at these 4 things here, they can all help us relate to our world today and see the importance of, or at least ask the question of, the importance of human interaction. So here are the discussion board questions. The first one has to do with this idea of what fears and concerns do you have today that might be similar to the ones people had at the time that the story embodied. So through the figure of the signal man, this story portrays many of the fears and concerns held by people from that time period. What similarities do you see between those fears and concerns and the ones that many of us have today? Do you think reading narratives where characters experience those fears can be cathartic and perhaps even helpful for readers? Consider your own reading experience. So as I mentioned before, this is a story where your emotional reaction to it as the reader, I think, is very important. And it's one that is about a character who embodies the fears of an entire nation. And I think that's something, a literary technique that's very appealing. And so if we have different fears today, because we're a different nation at a different time, there still might be some similarities. And what do you think, I want to know, of this process, this writing technique? With catharsis in the first lesson, we talked about how it can be helpful to see a character experiencing the things you're afraid of because you're not experiencing them yourself in that moment, and seeing those emotions play out and be purged and purified can help you as you struggle with, your own fears about that thing. And so I'm just curious to see, if this story is helpful and how it might be helpful to things you're worried about today, even though the immediate content and context is not the same as the things you're concerned about today. This story could still be helpful. Secondly, you could also choose to answer the theme or thread of doubling. So what similarities do you see between the signal man and the narrator? And why do you think Dickens would make the only 2 main characters in a relatively long and complex story so similar? In many ways, the narrator is like a conduit for us, a mirror for the signal man, but for us to allow us to enter into his world. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm just giving you something to launch you there. What else do you think about all of the doubling? And you can talk about more than just the narrator and the signal man, because there's all kinds of doubles in this story, as I've mentioned. Another thread we should definitely pursue here, so you could potentially answer question 3, is alienation, isolation. And what have you learned about this, right? We've seen a man who is alienated from society, isolated where he lives and works, spends all his time. What is this story? Very general question. I'm not going to give you more than that to go on because I really want it open-ended. I really want to hear what you think. What have you learned about this topic of alienation, isolation from the story? Finally, why are the conversations between the signal man and the narrator important? What do they teach us about human interactions? Building on what we learned in Lesson 2, how do these interactions teach us not just the best ways to interact with other people, but also, and moreover, the importance and value of interacting with other people? So again, I think there's a lot of debate here. I think they're introverts and extroverts. I tend to be more of an introvert. I like to be with other people, but I'm very drained and tired afterwards. My wife, on the other hand, gets energy from being with other people, but still enjoys spending a lot of time at home. So it's a spectrum, extrovert, introvert. And there were many people, myself included, who was kind of, a little bit glad at the start of COVID-19 to have to cancel some of my social engagements because my family and I are very busy, and I like being home with my wife and my kids. But the degree to which COVID-19 forced us to isolate, I would argue it was not a good thing for many people. And I was a little disoriented to see how many people were really embracing the isolation. How many people are saying, now that I know I can order my groceries and have them delivered to my house, I'm not going back out again. That to me is a little disconcerting. And so I think this is open for debate, but I think we see the effects, of permanent isolation in the single man, and a little bit of a glimpse of perhaps what can happen when we are able to talk to another person. Though here, the limited interaction with the narrator is not enough to save the signal man. So this is the question that gets at the heart of the bigger question: why, if we should interact with people, why is that the case? And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it.